Okay, thank you for joining us. My name is Greg Buter. I'm an applications engineer here at MCAD. What we're going to look at now is just some of the enhancements that have been added to SolidWorks 2014. So starting with that, let's first look at part files. So what's the first thing you do when you start SolidWorks design? Okay, well, the first thing you do is you start with a brand new sketch. So once you create the first sketch in your part, then what do you do? Well, you create a smart dimension, right? So you guys probably run into this scenario. So I'm adding a dimension here. I have the general sketch. Okay, I've captured my relations, sort of the design intent, and then I add my first dimension, and it ends up being something quite a bit different than what was on my screen. So then everything resizes, and I end up having to sort of clean up and move everything back. You can see it can be difficult as I add additional dimensions. So it's just kind of can be inefficient if I don't pay attention to those initial dimensions. So what SolidWorks 2014 has added is the ability for it to basically auto-scale. So take a look at this. So I add my first dimension here. Do you see that? Okay, so it didn't actually change the way my screen looks. So it automatically scaled to maintain the relationships here, maintain the scaling on my screen, while it actually adjusted everything to match the desired parameter that I just typed in there. Okay, so adding some other dimensions here. And let's say I want these two to be the same size. So if I go ahead and try to select them both using my window select, you can see the problem there. Okay, it selected all three things. Maybe you try to do this, but the problem when you do that is the window select in that, left to right, it grabs only the things inside there. So what we've typically been doing probably is just holding down Control and choosing the two entities we want. Okay, but in SolidWorks 2014, one of the new enhancements that you'll see here in the sketching environment is the lasso selection. So you can see if I go counterclockwise versus clockwise, the color's a little different. So it still maintains the, see how easy it is for me to select those? It maintains the cross select or window select direction. So you can see if I go this way, only the elements that were completely inside my sketch, while what I did is I just went that way, so anything crossing that, now I can easily make them equal. So SolidWorks 2014 adds the lasso selection option. So adding some additional dimensions here. And maybe the height. So what I've laid out here is sort of a belt drive mechanism. If I were actually designing this, I would be interested in what belt lengths are commercially available. Okay, I don't want to have to get a custom-made belt if I can walk into some store and pull off the desired belt length we need off of the shelf. So SolidWorks 2014 also includes a path length dimension. So I just select the items that I want to create the combined length out of. And you can see right here the parameter for the length of the belt length here, and maybe I make that, well, you can see I'll make it a nice round number, and you can see as I adjust that based on the degrees of freedom, you can see it responds accordingly. So some pretty neat stuff been added to the sketch environment in SolidWorks 2014. So let's take a look at some other sketch tools that have been added. Okay, the sketch conic and an enhancement to the splines. So in this part, see it was generated with various surfaces and splines and sweeps. So let's take a look at one of the sweeps here. So this is the path for a sweep, and what you'll see right here, it has the tangent arcs. Okay, and sometimes we might want something where there's a little bit more gradual transition of the curvature from the line to the arc. So if I delete these, I can replace them with a sketch conic. Now this conic tool was introduced in SolidWorks 2013, but what's been enhanced is how easy it is to add the auto tangency. Let's try that again. replace that one. Maybe I'll do the same thing here. And then you define those maybe with the row parameter. So the sketch conic tool is a little bit more user-friendly, and I'll also add one for the sweep cross-section, okay, the sweep profile of that same feature. So that gives me much more options when I'm creating sort of the smooth, sleek consumer product style parts. So now let's take a look at maybe the spline command. So the spline has always been a nice tool for creating shapes like this, but it can be a little bit more difficult to use if you're not familiar with it. So this spline is already pretty well constrained with the dimensions you see. But something I can actually do in 2014 is define a spline length dimension. So maybe I have this, I'm basing this length off a sheet of carbon fiber, or maybe just other material values, maybe a sheet of aluminum. So I can control this, nice round number. So spline length dimension has now been added in SolidWorks 2014. So like I was mentioning, the spline is a very powerful tool, but can be a little intimidating, especially for new users. So now let's take a look at some more tools for sketching the initial spline. But what you'll notice right around my cursor is it has sort of a little bump right there. Okay, it's not as smooth as it could be. So let's take a look at that sketch. So this spline, you don't see, there's not many relations or dimensions here, but when you're working with a spline like this, you're clicking every spline point and it's interpolating between those. And then to actually tweak it and make it as smooth as you want, what you're doing is you're going to analyze and observe these curvature combs, and you're tweaking these little control handles, moving spline points around, and you're trying to get this as smooth as possible. And so you just don't want to see any, there's an inflection point right there. You don't want to see any abrupt changes in the curvature. So you can do that. It just takes some minor adjusting, checking, minor adjusting. So it's a little bit more of a process. Okay, but what SolidWorks 2014 has added is a completely new method for sketching splines if you want to use it. It's called it's called style spline. So you'll notice as I'm sketching a new one here, just on top of what you see, I'm creating these control polygons practically, okay, these lines. So instead of all the spline points, I've created these lines, and you can see how it's mapping the spline to that general shape. So let's add some relations. So notice with these actual lines I've sketched, I can use them. Okay, I can create relations. I can define them with dimensions. So it gives me quite a bit more control, and just makes it more user-friendly, easier to achieve the results that we're after. Let's try that again. So maybe I get it to the shape I want, and like I said, I could add dimensions. But now what you want to see is let's look at the curvature comb of my new spline. So you see much smoother transition, and there's not any of those inflection points. So if I want to use this for the feature, I can't just click the OK button, because right now I have two different splines. So what I want to do is get rid of the one that was initially there. But if I do that, then I might run into problems with downstream features, okay, features that depended on the edges generated from this previous spline. So another very powerful tool that's been added to SolidWorks 2014 is a replace entities command. So I can just specify this spline, okay, that's the old one, I want to replace it with this new one. And then I have the options about making the initial one construction or deleting it, which I'll do in this case. We don't need that first one. So this helps the downstream features, okay, the child features, update because they're now aware that they reference this new spline as opposed to the previous one. And you can see the results here. It's much smoother. It doesn't have that dip down. So a lot of tools added to maybe create some more organic type shapes, consumer products. So let's throw that one away. Now let's take a look at some of the enhancements to the SolidWorks sheet metal. So this shape right here was generated with the swept flange tool. Okay, and it's always been a real powerful, it was added, I want to say, in 2012, and it's a real powerful sheet metal tool, but sometimes the problem you can encounter with it is when you create the flat pattern. So this flat pattern is not really the pattern I wanted for manufacturing. Okay, I want it to be more rectangular. So instead of it following the bottom face, I want it to follow the inside face more or less. So what we can do in SolidWorks 2014 is if I edit the swept flange, I can identify which is the fixed edge. So the part looks exactly the same, but now if I flatten this, you can see a much more desirable blank, okay, much more desirable geometry here. Another highly recommended enhancement has been implemented here, the sheet metal gusset. So you can see if I choose these two faces, it's creating this formed sheet metal gusset. And I can adjust all these parameters over here. So it can change the height there, the location. So all the parameters that you've come to expect here inside your property manager are available for altering this sheet metal gusset. If I accept that, and I'll add another one just onto this side. So sheet metal gusset, another very useful feature added to the sheet metal functionality. So in this part, what I'm going to look at is the sheet metal lofted bend. So that feature has always been there, but as far as manufacturing, it's always represented formed geometry. Now what we can do is, you can see right there, the manufacturing method, we can specify that it's bent. So you can make this a little bit more useful and make it match your manufacturing processes. So when it was formed, it was just, it would look like this, and I'd still be able to get the flat pattern. But if it's bent, I can specify the segment length or the segment angle or the number of bends. So just to create a comparison here, let's set number of bends at 6. While this one here is going to be set at maybe the segment angle. And you can see it's creating several planar faces to match that geometry, to match the profiles used in the loft. And if I create the flat pattern, you can see the bend lines represent the parameters I typed in. So still talking about some new functionality added to the part files. Now let's take a look at the weldment features as well as just multi-body parts in general. So weldment tools, mainly the structural member tool, is commonly used for steel framework like this. There's also been, the name can be misleading. It doesn't necessarily have to be weldable materials. It's just things created with common standard profiles. Okay, I've seen it used to create sort of woodwork, cabinetry, shelving, or crown molding, maybe. Just stuff that has the same cross-section. But what you'll see here in this table, let go ahead and hide that. But if we look at, well, first thing, take a look at this appearance. See how the edges are bleeding through right there? Okay, there is now a setting in our options where you can optimize it for thin parts. So if I look at my system options, right here, I could turn on that option to optimize for thin parts if I'm using lots of sheet metal parts like this. So back to the weldment topic here. So these pieces were all created using the Weldment tool, using the structural member command. So if I go over here and I look at, let's just compare some of the files. So in the past, all the weldments, every different size that you could choose, each size was created from its own library feature part. So for example, if I look at rectangle tubing, you'll see to represent all the sizes available that we might use, there's all these different parts. Okay, each one is just a sketch, but it's a different part file. If you want to change your size, you can edit it and you just select a different part. And you can run into sometimes some update problems if the parts, this part made up of, we'll say 10 different sketch entities. This one is 10 different sketch entities as well, but it's different sketch entities. So sometimes dependent features, if you do trim commands, those might be difficult, or you might just have to go through those and update them to repair errors you might encounter. Well, what SolidWorks 2014 now added was configurable weldment profiles. So all those parts that you just saw, all those different sizes, are now represented with this single part because it has multiple configurations. So it's easy to add and adjust these because you can see the configurations are all here, but they're also controlled by an Excel table. So you can easily edit that table and maybe add new rows, okay, to represent new sizes, or you could get rid of the sizes you will never use. Okay, well, let's return back to our part. So let's say I want to go ahead and take advantage of that. So I'm going to change some of the sizes here. So it is currently 3.5 by 2.5. I'll change that up maybe to 3 by 2, 1/8 wall. And you can see right up there, the configure just represents that it still works with the old style if you have a bunch of those already in your libraries, but the new ones that have several configurations will be identified by the word configured there. Okay, so I changed the size of those, and maybe we'll change the size of this crossbar and the legs. Currently it's a 2-inch square tube. Make that 1.5. And notice that the legs as well as these crossbars are trimmed correctly. So configurable weldment profiles have been added. Another thing dealing with configurations is you can actually, equations are now configurable. So let's create a new configuration. And I'm just going to make a square table. So in the past, I could easily just go in here, and this would certainly still work, but in this layout sketch for my weldment, this dimension right here, I could just double-click and give it the same value as this one. Okay, but if I know I want it to be square, I could also use an equation here. So right here, I can say it applies to just this configuration. Hit the equal sign, and it automatically brought me into equation mode, essentially. And you can see it is going to be equal to that sketch, and this symbol here identifies that it's only in this equation. So there's the square table, and you'll notice if I jump back to the rectangular table, that equation is essentially turned off. So equations are now configurable. So if we look at some other geometry here, the counterbore hole here, see if I edit the hole wizard, what you'll notice, slots are now supported with the hole wizard. So I could change that to a counterbore slot. And when I click the positions, I can locate this. I can also adjust the angle and the length of it. A few other things. Okay, so I want to do a cut with this. Is the end condition through all in both directions? So I no longer have to select direction 2. Now let's just look at some editing or deleting options. So that was sketched on this plane. If I try to delete that plane, this can now be turned off. So I can specify that I don't want to delete the child features. And now they'll remain, they'll just have errors. So to repair that, let me create a new plane. And I'll just create a new plane right at the center of the midplane, sort of those two faces. But this blue arrow, okay, that is also new. We can now define the normal position or the normal direction when we're creating planes. So also known as sort of the positive direction of that plane. So if we need to create new planes and maybe move sketches from plane to plane, that can definitely help out make sure that it's not sort of the mirrored opposite of what we want. So now to fix these, I can move that sketch to my new plane and do the same thing for this other one that is missing a plane. So creating other reference geometry, so that was a quick look at planes, but as far as creating reference points, that has also been enhanced. So let's turn on some of my axes, temporary axes. Okay, so if I want to create reference points, in the past it had to be actual intersections. Okay, so what you'll notice if I choose that and that right there, you can see how it is creating the the reference point at that intersection. Okay, that one is a physical intersection, but if I choose it out here, so where that axis would be intersecting this plane, or even where an axis intersects another axis. So some more additional functionality added for using reference points. If we look at the volume properties here, let's turn off those axes. So right here, volume, there's been some enhancements here. Notice I could choose things like gallons, liters, and if I look at the actual properties of this part, or of the, if I want to get an idea of how much, volume of that box right there, let's take a look at that cutlass property. Okay, there it is. So you can see that body right there has the volume property that's being evaluated at 23 liters. So that might help out with creating the drawings or linking to those properties to get an idea of the design of the assembly or part in this case. Another enhancement has to do with properties, but it has to do with when you export properties to, if I save this part right here, if I save this body and put it in a new part, what happens to the cut list properties of that specific body? So you can see right here, if I look at the properties, it's telling me the material and the stock size, as well as the bounding box thickness and whatnot. So if I take that and I insert it into a new part, right here I can say what's going to transfer with it. And if I say the cut list properties, okay, those properties we just looked at, what are they going to transfer as? Okay, they can transfer as file properties in the new part or as cut list properties. So if I do file properties, and I look at those file properties, you'll see there is the link to parent properties that were being pulled from that source part now. And this works not just specific to Weldments, it works for multi-body parts. So now let's switch gears a little bit and we're going to take a look at some of the enhancements to SolidWorks drawing files. So a lot of enhancements you'll see here. So starting with this drawing, if I open this part, in this actual part file, notice how I can have the title block, okay, this table in here with which might have notes linked to the drawn by, checked by, as well as any other properties. So what SolidWorks 2014 has added here is an annotation plane, a 2D plane right here that we can then put notes and tables on so that we could do stuff like this. Okay, I can have tables, bill of materials with properties linked to. So this might allow me to get to model-based definition or paperless design. So it's pretty neat functionality to take advantage of if you are using model-based definition. And you would also add things like tall analysts so that you could completely dimension this in the 3D and maybe avoid creating the 2D drawings altogether. Okay, but back to the drawings to see some of the new functionality. If I want to add some new views here, in the past, if I used this view palette and I brought in a, I wanted to put another, another view like this, I would look in the view palette and it wouldn't be there. So now what it actually lets you do, once a drawing view was used, it would remove it from the view palette. So you can see that it allows me to add additional instances of the same view. Or if I add maybe an isometric here, you'll notice that once it's placed and I look back on the view palette, it has that symbol. That is now letting me know that this view is used, but it also allows me to use the same view multiple times. So this is a single part. So maybe I get to this far and I realize the drawing was supposed to be of an assembly, or another scenario is maybe this is a good starting point to also create the assembly drawing that has the same part. Commonly, I might see this used if you have sheet metal parts and you start creating that sheet metal drawing and then you realize that the sheet metal is actually going to be an assembly because you have to put the nut certs in. So you could have the drawing like this, and what I'm actually able to do is replace what's being shown here. Okay, I can replace this model and tell it to use an assembly, and since it contains the same part, the assembly contains the same part, these dimensions will update and stay exactly like they are without becoming dangling. So I just right-click a view, go to Replace Model. I specify all views, and even though this is a part, it does let me specify an assembly to replace it with. And I can specify individual views, or like I mentioned, this case, I'm going to do all views. And now that it's an assembly, this section view, the section line right here, if I want to jog that, maybe go through this hardware stack right here, I can do that. But what's really neat about editing it is if I edit the cutting line, it now allows me to edit it in the same sort of tool that I was able to use when I inserted that. You know, this, instead of editing just the sketch, I can use this section view assistant tool. So I can make sure that it snaps to go through that. And so now if I look over here, you can see that little hardware stack. Another enhancement has to do with stacked balloons. So if I click that piece and place it, now I click these other pieces, so you'll see I'm creating this stacked balloon. In the past, if I wanted to reorder this, I would simply have to delete those 3 balloons and start over. But now what I can actually do is reattach which component they're pointing to. So if I reattach that one to that one, and then this balloon, I don't want it to be there twice, so let me reattach that one to this last piece. So that is new functionality that was added to SolidWorks 2014, the ability to reattach stacked balloons. So let's say I want to add some more dimensions here. Notice if I right-click this edge, I have the option to find intersection. So it's creating a virtual sharp based on my edges here. It's just a more intuitive method instead of having to create the virtual sharp myself and then dimension it. So other enhancements have to do with the extension lines and leaders of a dimension like this. So quick look at those. If I go to dual dimensions maybe, one of my new options is the ability to split that. So you can see how it's shown above and below. Okay, if I turn that off, it also gives me different text boxes here. So I can add text above. And another area that we can adjust, like I said, has to do with the dimension leaders, extension lines here. I can independently change the line style there. So different options to make sure the drawing can appear the way we want. So this was a section view like we talked about. And notice you see the cross-hatching there. Everything looks like what we'd expect. Let me actually open this part. And if I do a section view in the part, what you might notice, especially if I zoom in, that this is actually a surface. Okay, this part is a surface body. So SolidWorks 2014 in our drawings, in the drawing section views, it actually supports surface bodies now. And some other stuff, let's add a detail view to see some dimensioning enhancements. The label here for the scale, that actually is dynamic now, so if I did double click that, so I made it 2:1, or if I go back to the view and change it, the note updates. So you can basically control it by editing the note. So adding some dimensions here and some annotations. I'll start with the whole call out. So like you'd expect out of the hole wizard, the hole callout supports the slots as well. Let's look at center marks, also supporting these slots here. If I add some smart dimensions here, and you'll notice this angular dimension, see how I can soft snap to that other leader. Let's get rid of that one. So another dimensioning style that was added is the radial running dimensions here, angular running dimensions. So I define my 0, and notice as I click these other edges or center marks, it's very similar to ordinate dimensioning. And just like ordinate dimensioning, if I realize I forgot one of these, I can just right-click one of them, add to running dimension. So this new dimensioning, if I go under leaders, you'll see that I can do bidirectional. And we could also do display as chain dimensions if we want. The symbol library is a lot easier to use as well. So let's just create a simple note. So right here, if I go to my symbol library, you can already tell right here it's a little bit more graphical. If I click more symbols, same deal. So if I switch to maybe some of my geometric tolerancing, now I had caps lock on when I typed that note, but just for a demonstration here, let's look at this note that's here. Okay, this note is attached to the front view, and it was created just to point that out so that you can see what happens when I change it to attach it to a different view. In the past, my only method of doing that was to copy this note or cut the note and activate a different view and then paste it, and then it wouldn't be in the same location. I would have to move it back to where I wanted. But it is also telling me a property of the model you can see, and it's also just telling me, hey, this note shouldn't move, and we want it to be uppercase. So both of those things are now easy to control. So if I right-click this note and I say attach to view, so now it's telling me, hey, it's attached to the detail B. Okay, it did not move, so we check that off the list, but it says it should be an uppercase. So what we can also do here is tell the note to be all uppercase. And in our system options, we also have the ability in the document properties to specify some exclusions, millimeters, centimeters, the units, we might want to keep those lowercase. So in our assembly drawing, now let's take a look at, let's add a second sheet for the bill of materials. Notice what this one looks like. It has the note as well as more cells in this little table. Okay, I added the second sheet, and you'll see that it now is quite a bit different. So in SolidWorks 2014, we have the functionality. If I look under document properties, right here I can tell it to use a different sheet for additional sheets, a different sheet format for additional sheets. So I'll insert a new bill of materials. New properties were added, okay, for toolbox. So if I actually go here and we insert a column to the right, instead of just custom properties, I now can do toolbox properties. And I can link to maybe the part name or specification. Or the standard. guess I did undo. Let's do that again. So reinserting the bill of materials, parts only, it's attaching to the anchor. So we can do toolbox properties as you just saw. Another thing you can actually do is you can define an auto sort or auto split. So if I say this is going to split after, we have 27 rows, so after 28 rows, but we're going to do it continuously. So if something happens, you'll see, and it increases the component count, it'll automatically split the table. So let's go back to the assembly, and to see this in action, I will unsuppress some of the parts that are currently suppressed. And jumping back to this drawing's bill of materials. You'll see it automatically split after 28th, and here's the new split section of the table, maintaining the same column headings. So a lot of new stuff added to our drawing functionality in SolidWorks 2014. And in the remainder of our time here, let's take a quick look at some of the enhancements to SolidWorks assemblies. So one of them has to do with exploded views. So the interface has always been pretty straightforward when you're creating an exploded view. You click the thing you want to move, and you can click on the arrows to move it. Okay, but you'll see all these different rings now. Okay, and that's indicating the ability to actually rotate things. So I'll bring those two nuts out. Then the next step, bring the bolts. Okay, now what I'm going to do is take that tire shock. I'm going to move this to the center axis. Can drag that up. So see how you can rotate. And now maybe I move the entire thing up as well. So exploding view has always been a great way to maybe show assembly instructions, especially if you want to save the animation. But you can see that this can be that much more informative now. So exploded views, still just as easy to use, but now allow you to create or define rotational steps. This same shock assembly here, see how when I click that, right here are the configurations that are available. So it's much quicker to access the configurations of your assemblies or of your parts in an assembly. So this one is extended. Let's switch it up to the collapsed or retracted configuration. Let's switch it to the free configuration. And I try to move this, and it still doesn't move because this is still considered a rigid subassembly. So another thing that is easy to access on this quick pop-up toolbar is toggling an assembly back and forth between flexible and rigid. Mirroring components, that's also been enhanced. So one of the options, there's more mates that can be mirrored with the components, or sort of specifying the location of the mirrored parts is also something we can control. So the mirror type, you're specifying whether it's mirrored about center of mass or bounding box center. So currently it's on center of mass. Just for a demonstration here, let me, that's what created the two opposite version of these guys. Okay, but if I unsuppress this part, that is throwing off the center of mass, so now you'll notice that this doesn't line up correctly with the axis here, or the bolts up here. So if that would have instead been mirrored about sort of the centroid, the center of the bounding box, you'll see then it would maintain the correct orientation and position. As far as our selection manager, there's also an enhancement there. Okay, you can select things by size. So based on the size here, you can see that I can maybe choose just my smaller parts. Maybe I hide them or suppress them. Just another option when we're trying to select specific components in our assembly. And we can actually view mates on features. So if I take cut extrude or something like that, and you can see when I click it, I could do view mates. So I can see that piece right there actually has a concentric mate. So you can get a better idea of what would happen as you edit and maybe delete features of your part or suppress features. So you can view mates that are attached to, or yeah, that are referencing specific features. If you look in this feature manager, there's also history here. So I can see the things that I've recently edited, maybe quickly access those instead of having to browse through my entire feature manager. So continuing talking about assemblies here, let's look at assembly mates. So if I want to line this part up with these holes, okay, there has been Smart Mate functionality. Okay, it basically, if you haven't seen it before, I hold down the Alt key and I start left clicking and dragging this. And you'll notice as I get over other cylindrical geometry, it snaps and tries to solve a concentric mate with that geometry. And you'll notice that for this, I'm actually pausing on there before it swings into position. Okay, there's a little slider bar in our options that controls sort of the delay. In the past, as I was moving it around, it would just be jumping around. Okay, in 2013, anytime I get over one of these shapes, this part would be jumping around trying to do the concentric, just like this. So if I set that up, do the same thing here. Actually, before I add, I'm going to mate things a little differently so we can look at something else. So I undid lining up the second hole. So you can see it does this. If I try to select maybe, we'll say this edge and this edge and create a mate, it can't do that because by default, it has always wanted to do coincident. So if I choose those and I hit the mate command, it actually tries to do coincident, and if that can't be solved, instead of giving me an error message like it used to, it now defaults to trying to solve parallel. Continuing mates here, let's add this to that. So I'll just hold down Control and select them, and look at that. I don't even actually have to hit the mate command anymore. Okay, I can hit concentric right on this pop-up toolbar. So it's much more like sketch relations. Okay, and combining that with that Alt method, left click, drop it on that face. So this one can still spin. Okay, here's something else that was added. Dragging that to that face, it's doing concentric, but right there I have the ability to lock rotation. So it's not creating a separate mate, it is now just an option of your concentric mate. So we looked at that control method, I just click, hold down Control, click the two things I want to mate, and then right here. So a few more of those. Looks like I clicked the edge there. tapping the tab key, you can see how it flips the alignment automatically. So it can be much quicker to create or assemble your components with some of this new functionality that's been added. And one more thing we'll look at here regarding assemblies is patterning. So assembly patterns, they've changed the name of a couple things to be more consistent with what we've seen in the parts, as well as added a couple more options. So if I look at my component patterns, linear and circular have always been there, but instead of feature-driven pattern, we now call it pattern-driven. We've had, notice, sketch-driven, curve-driven. Those also are just like what you've seen in the parts. So if I do a curve-driven pattern here, I'm going to base it off a sketch that's already present. And I'm going to pattern that and that. And as far as the quantity here, and we'll do offset to maintain the offset from the sketch, as well as tangency. So what's also nice, once a pattern exists in my assembly, it's easier to identify which feature or which component is the seed feature. Because simply just by clicking on the pattern in the tree, you can see the color identifies that, hey, this is the seed feature. Okay, that's the one that was actually patterned. And that's pretty convenient because when you want to identify what you might want to, if you want to create additional patterns, you probably would want to be able to click the seed features if you can, as opposed to patterning a pattern. But let's do one more pattern option here. For the components to pattern, I can pattern, I can pattern that piece, and the driving pattern is choosing that. So notice, if I would have clicked on this previous pattern, I would have been able to tell that, hey, this is not the seed feature, this is instead something that was generated from a new pattern. So a little bit more enhancement that you'll see there that is in the assembly. We've added some things, like you saw, mates are much easier, and now the component patterns are a little bit more consistent with what you've seen in your part files, and also a couple new options were added. So we're going to stop there. Hopefully you saw some nice things that have been added to SolidWorks 2014 that you can take advantage of. There's a lot more enhancements than just what I covered, and you can find those on the Help pull-down menu of your new software. If you go to What's New, you can see that you can open the entire PDF and see everything listed. And there's also the interactive one, which is going to give you some sort of step-through examples to go through stuff like this. Thanks again for joining us, and also please check out some of the other videos we have here uploaded showing you what's new in simulation, enterprise, and also maybe the 3D VIA or SolidWorks Composer. Thanks again. Goodbye.